joke to kick things off. How do mother cows keep baby or children cows quiet? They hit the mood button. Sorry, only our kids had one of those. Let me just add to Ash's thing before. Happy Mother's Day. Thank you for spending the morning with us, and we pray that it will be a good day for you. It'll be a day where you experience connection with Jesus, and that, just that you will experience that sense of God's love with you this morning. Thinking about what I was going to share out of the reading this morning, and I was reminded of one of the things that Zoe likes to have a crack at me about from time to time, and that is the day that she thinks I left her at Coles at Knox City. Now, to be fair, in my defence, she was quite small at the time, and I had other kids around, and I did come back to her after a day or so. She thinks I took the other two to the car and left her wandering around Coles. It's possible. But I think for Zoe, she's mostly over the trauma of that now. She still clings to my leg whenever we wander around Coles, but mostly she's over it. I think, though, that there are seasons where we go through life, moments maybe, or transitions, or changes, or tragedies, that can leave us feeling like Zoe probably did at the time. Like we've been abandoned, or like we've been orphaned, maybe. And when we feel like that, whether spoken or unspoken, the questions often begin. And we can feel it in our bodies, but the questions start running through our mind. What do I do now? Where do I go? What happens next? Is this going to work out? Who will love or nurture or guide me? Who's on my side? What's going to become of me now that this thing's happening? And those are the sorts of questions that I kind of imagine running through the heads and hearts of the disciples in the reading. It's the Last Supper, and part of what Tim read is part of Jesus' farewell discourse that runs over, I think it's John 13, 14, 15. 13, yeah, I think that's right. But it's part of this farewell discourse. The disciples have been fed, feet have been washed, the betrayer has left, it is night, it is dark, and Jesus announces he's leaving. The one for whom they left everything now says he's leaving. The world is getting turned on its ear, and the questions start. We don't know where you're going. How do we know the way? Show us the Father. These are more orphan questions, in a sense. Tim Keller calls this mindset functional orphanhood. God with our heads, but we live as orphans with our hearts. We carry the crushing weight of being our own provider and our own anchor when the storms of life rise up, or when things start to get scarce. We feel like, well, if it is to be, it's up to me. And that weight gets really heavy. And I think deep down, many of us live with that fear of being abandoned, of not being enough. Maybe like so, of being left to our own devices somewhere that we just don't quite understand how it works. And I think that fear points to a deeper reality that by ourselves we know we're not enough. We want to be, but we know we're not. I think that's one of the effects of this widening Gaia that I spoke about last week. Just as a reminder, we spoke about this idea of how do we live when everything feels like it's pulling apart, where everything feels like it's being torn apart and it's flinging faster and faster. How do we live with a sense of peace? How do we appropriate Jesus' words about don't be troubled in a world of trouble? That feeling that we have from time to time, it's not caused because there's something wrong with us. It's because we were never intended or created to be self-sufficient. We were never intended to stand alone as individuals. We were created to love and be loved, to live in relationship as persons giving themselves to each other, to dwell, to abide, and to remain with each other, even as the Father is in Jesus and Jesus is in the Father. And that's the antithesis of being orphaned, and it's what it means in part to be created in the image of God, that we were created for relationship, to live with each other, to lean on each other, not to go through life alone. Jesus makes this promise to the disciples in the middle of all of this turmoil, in the middle of this change and this transition and all the questions. He says, I will not leave you orphaned. That's the promise. Regardless of the circumstances of our lives, storms, death, separation, we never have been and we never will be orphaned by God. I will not leave you orphaned. I reckon that must have sounded fairly strange to the disciples. In fact, I reckon the whole speech is one of those speeches that would leave you scratching your head a bit. You know, the things that Jesus says, when you think about the background of what's coming, this fever pitch that's coming up behind Jesus about when is he going to take the throne? What are the authorities going to do? When is rebellion going to happen? When are we going to rise up and the kingdom going to happen and all the rest of it? And there's this pivotal meal. And Jesus starts talking and he says, don't let your hearts be troubled. In the world you'll have trouble, but don't let your hearts be troubled. I'm leaving, but I'm coming back. There's a new counselor coming. You'll do greater works than me. And on it goes. And the thing is, Jesus' speech in this chapter is not so much a riddle to be solved. It's an invitation and a means to see life in a different way. And that's what Jesus is setting before us this morning. An opportunity to look at our lives a little bit differently. See, I think at its core, this becomes a question of whether Jesus is for us a past memory or a present reality. A sentimental story, if you like, that makes us feel good, or a living presence who guides and challenges and nurtures our life. And according to Jesus, the answer to that question is determined by love. And that love is revealed and fulfilled in the way we keep his commandments. To love our neighbour as ourselves. To love our enemies and forgive. To love the Lord our God with all our heart and soul and mind and strength. Whose feet do we wash? For Christians, for followers of Jesus, love is the language of home. N.T. Wright talks about the idea that the keeping the commandments that Jesus talks about, it's not a test to see if we're allowed to stay in God's family. It's the way we live because we are already part of God's family. It's the language of home. So I think when we think of ourselves as orphans, as one out against the system or alone or, that sort of thing, when we live, in Keller's words, functionally orphaned, what happens is commands become rules, things that you follow to avoid being kicked out. When you're a child, these commands are the wisdom of a father who wants you to flourish. And there's a difference. Jesus is not saying, love your neighbour as yourself or else. What he's saying is this is the way we live life to the full. By embracing this ethic of love, by expressing God's love to the world as we encounter it. See, we keep his commands because the advocate that Jesus speaks of convinces us his way is the way of life. Love is the sign that Jesus' message is taking root in our lives. And we're not left to work this out on our own. This is where Jesus gives us the remedy. He promises another helper, a paraclete. Some translations render this as helper, others counselor. The NIV and the New Living all call it the advocate. And the term parakletos derives from the Greek word parakaleo, meaning to come alongside or to call alongside. John uses this word 5 times in his writing, 4 times in the gospel in this space, and then once in his second letter to the church. And the idea is that God's Spirit is the ultimate source of companionship. The Holy Spirit acts as a divine helper who walks alongside believers through life's challenges. Jesus says the Spirit is another advocate, not different. The Greek word there means of the same kind of companion and presence that the disciples had already known in Jesus is what Jesus is promising in this passage. I think sometimes we struggle with this though because we get the advocate picture backwards. When we picture the Spirit of God as an advocate, I think sometimes what happens is we imagine something akin to a courtroom scene with lawyers and a judge. And the advocate stands with us before God and tries to persuade the judge, tries to persuade God to forgive and love and accept. To make the argument that maybe yes, Mark has been a naughty boy, but he should be given another chance. I think that's how I saw my relationship with God for a long time. The Spirit was the advocate. The Spirit was kind of interceding between me and God so that God wouldn't reject me because I was living like an orphan. Well, maybe that is now or has been your understanding. But I reckon there's a better way to think about the role of the Spirit as an advocate. See, in John's Gospel, the flow of God's love is often the other direction. We don't need the advocate to change God's mind about us because that doesn't fit a God who so loved the world. It's contrary to Jesus saying that he came not to condemn the world, but to save, heal, and transform. That's John 3:17. I came, Jesus said, that they may have life and have it abundantly. This idea of God not liking us or having to be convinced to continually convinced to accept us, that doesn't reflect a Jesus portrayed by the gospel writers. The Jesus who chose the poor and the broken and the sinful. The Jesus who healed and transformed lives. A Jesus who excluded no one. A Jesus who assures us there's room for us in his Father's house. A Jesus characterized by love and forgiveness and welcome. And the thing is, if that's who Jesus is, then that's who the Father is as well. Whoever has seen me, Jesus says, has seen the Father. Always remember, particularly when the orphan voice starts speaking up, God is like Jesus. If you want to know who God is or what he is like, look at Jesus. If you want to know what it means to be human, look at Jesus. If you want to know what it is to love, look at Jesus. And go on looking until you're not just a spectator, but you're actually part of the action. That's from N.T. Wright. So I think one of the things we need to reimagine or revisit sometimes is that the advocate's role may not be to change God's mind about us, but to change our mind about ourselves and about each other. What if part of the advocacy role of the Spirit that the Spirit plays in our lives is advocating for God's way of living with us? Don Carson says that the Spirit's job is to represent Jesus to us. He doesn't bring new information. He brings the reality of Jesus home to our hearts so that Jesus is no longer just a theory, but a felt presence. Later on in the same address, Jesus will say to the disciples, the Advocate will teach you everything and remind you of all that I said to you. He says that in John 14:26. In other words, all the stuff like, don't let your hearts be troubled. I am with you always to the end of the age. Just as I have loved you, you should also love one another. And on it goes. And I think we all need the advocate, the spirit, the counselor, the helper to play that role in our life. Because we forget. We get distracted. We think we know better. And someone once said that one of the big differences between me and God is that Jesus never thinks that I'm his mark. I don't know if that makes sense, that sometimes we make the mistake of thinking that we're God and that it's all up to us and that we need to do this and need to fix this and blah, blah, blah. It's not the way it works. We need at times the Spirit's role in our life to remind us of who we really are, of who God is and our place in the scheme of things. And I know I need to be reminded from time to time, especially when the future is uncertain or life has been turned upside down and I'm afraid or overwhelmed. I need to have the Spirit whisper in my ear at that time, be brave. I need to be reminded when I'm angry or frustrated. I need to be reminded of God's way when I'm sad and I'm grieving. And when I'm busy and successful and self-sufficient. I need to be reminded when I'm lost and don't know the way. I need to be reminded when I feel like an orphan, alone, lonely, on my own, in the dark, by myself. But no, I won't do that. But having to look out for and fend for myself. One of the ways Jesus reminds me is with this promise, I will not leave you as an orphan. I'll ask the Father and he'll give you another advocate. And the thing is, Jesus can promise they'll not be orphaned because death itself will not separate him from them. The advocate does not just remind us of what Jesus said, however. Google could do that. We're actually invited to participate in this kingdom that Jesus establishes. One scholar, a guy called John Caputo, says that the Spirit of God is not some formless, invisible, eternal essence floating high above the earth. His idea is that the Spirit of God is felt in the rumblings and the restlessness of the heart, insisting, calling, luring, and soliciting our response in the concrete conditions of life. In other words, the advocate shows up every time you and I embody God's life and Spirit. Not replacing the Spirit, but carried along by the Spirit. Because we're the ones that are sent. We're the ones who make God's life present and tangible. The hands of Jesus, if you like. We're the ones who give flesh to Jesus' words. You and I are advocates filled with the Spirit of God. Paul uses a different word. He calls us ambassadors, ministers of reconciliation. Just at the moment, have you ever thought of yourself as someone through who God's advocacy becomes visible? I think that kind of advocacy always looks like love and affirms life. When your heart breaks for the pain of the world and you reach out in compassion, when you weep over another's loss, you're acting as the advocate in that moment. Again, Paul's word would be ambassador. When you offer or seek forgiveness, when you refuse to judge, when mercy rather than condemnation is your way, you're providing a tangible picture of God's kingdom. And you're living as a minister of reconciliation. And it works the other way. When someone encourages you or stands beside you and says exactly what you need to hear in that moment, or shows up at just the right time, you're experiencing God's advocacy. When someone listens to your life, celebrates your joys, cries over your losses, the Spirit is with you, and you haven't been orphaned by God. When you love or are loved, the Spirit is present. When another speaks the truth or offers guidance that helps change your life's trajectory, they're advocating on your behalf. When you speak words of hope or hold another's needs or concerns as important as your own, or pray for another, you're their advocate. Advocates sit at the bedside of another. They care for the sick and the dying. They console the bereaved. And in so doing, we make God's kingdom tangible. We put flesh on the picture that Jesus is painting. The climax of the passage that Tim was reading is verse 19. Jesus says, "Because I live, you also will live." The one the disciples feared losing is the one that death could not hold. It changes everything about what it means to feel abandoned. The resurrection is God's answer to the questions that assail us. Death does not win. Abandonment is not a thing with God. Because if the grave can't hold Jesus, what on earth is going to get in the way? Resurrection faith is sustained because we have a helper, a counselor, an advocate who constantly reminds us the tomb is empty, that death has been defeated. And we're empowered because we aren't trying to generate our own life anymore. It's not us against the world. We're plugged into the life of the risen Christ who has overcome the world. As you go through your week, the orphan voice will speak up from time to time. It always does. But that's not the truest voice in your world. The advocate is speaking too, reminding, calling, comforting, correcting, leading. When the orphan voice speaks up, remember what Jesus says. I will not leave you orphaned. And he hasn't. And he won't. Let's pray, and Soren and Marcella and Smitha can come up and lead us.